Welcome, everyone. My guest today is Selma Hepp, Chief Economist at CoreLogic, to talk about home prices and how migration patterns away from big cities are affecting prices across the country.
We may have just gotten back from Gathering of Eagles, but we're not done with events for 2023 yet. This October, we're headed right back to Austin, Texas for HousingWire Annual, and we want to see you there. We've got a power-packed agenda with content such as our Women of Influence speakers, peak performer playbooks, CEO playbooks, and more to propel your company forward, as well as a bunch of networking events. Because this event is open to real estate executives, mortgage, title, and everyone in between, you really have the opportunity to network with people from all across the housing ecosystem. If you want to learn more about the event, or if you're already ready to get registered, head over to HousingWire.com on the events tab and you can learn all about it. Not to mention, if you're an HW Plus member, you're going to get 50% off your ticket. So get registered for HW Plus and get registered for the event so we can see you out in Austin.
Selma, welcome back to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me, Sarah.
It is great to have you on. So you and I are here at the CoreLogic Core Connect conference in a beautiful venue, let me just say, in California. And you gave a talk about the state of homeownership that I really wanted to dig in on some of those details because it was really interesting. So the first thing I wanted to ask you about was home prices. Probably one of the most surprising things about this year with mortgage rates going up is that home prices didn't come down more. So what do you attribute that to?
Right. So that was one of the things this year is we had so many surprises, and in terms of the labor market, I talked a little bit about that in terms of the consumer resiliency, which actually feeds into home prices. So what we saw this year is home prices rebounding as soon as February of this year. So home prices started to decline in summer of last year after mortgage rates it started increasing rapidly. And after 7 months of declines, we saw a huge increase on a month-over-month basis in terms of home prices nationally. And so February, March, April, home prices were up at times by double the rate that they usually are during this time of the year, because there's seasonality in prices, right? And so historically, it's not more than, like, say, 1% increase from February to March or March to April. But in April, we saw as much as 1.6% increase in home prices. And really the main reason here is inventory, right? What mortgage rate impacted potential home buyers, that also impacted potential home sellers. And, both are sitting on sidelines still to some extent, more so sellers than buyers. And so, inventory is down. And, one chart that I was showing is basically where inventory was coming out of the Great Recession or during Great Recession and where the inventory is now. And that's really contributing to huge difference in how the housing market is playing out right now. Because going into Great Recession, we had some 4 million existing homes available for sale. Now we are at like less than 1 million, right? 4 times lower. And the inventory of new homes for sale is only now catching up to the levels that where it was going into the Great Recession, because also during Great Recession, we saw peak or the highest levels of new construction. So there was a whole lot of inventory there at the time that, meant that there was no really a price floor to be had. And home prices once when, job market unraveled, started declining precipitously and were down some 40%. This is not what we saw now. We saw home prices decline, basically peak to trough, only about 3%. Not nationally, naturally, but there are markets, West Coast markets, that is been more than that. But even with that, their 10% or 13% peak to trough, that was the biggest one in Seattle. I mean, that's so much lower than what we saw, coming out of the Great Recession. So it's a really different set of fundamentals at play that's helping prop home prices right now.
So you mentioned Seattle. We know that some of the West Coast markets have seen a little bit of price declines, right? But even in those, you feel like we've sort of hit the bottom and bounced back off.
Yeah. So we track those, and that, right now we're laser focused to see, where those markets go. And in many of them, we did see home prices rebound. So while that in Seattle, that peak to trough was 13%, now it's some 10% current to that peak. So home prices have rebounded over the last few months in those markets as well. So basically, there are very few markets left where we continue to see home prices declining on a month-over-month basis.
So that's also when we think about those home prices, we're coming off of, it's not like, oh, compared to, some really low year. I mean, these have been going up. So tell us where we are compared to, say, like 2019, which might be the most recent example of a quote unquote normal market.
Right. So home prices have gone up some 40% since the onset of the pandemic. And in some markets, it's much, much more than that. Before the declines on the West Coast or Mountain West markets, like Idaho, comes to mind because that was the Zoom boom market during the pandemic. Home prices were up as much as 60%, and now they have come down. But keep in mind that some markets actually have not even seen any declines yet. And think about like Florida markets; they're still going strong. And most recently, I was looking at home prices in Bay Area of Florida, and home prices there are up 70%
Wow.
since the onset of the pandemic, right? So now naturally that puts those markets at risk of potential home price declines going forward, just simply because they've gone up so much. But that's a huge, that's almost doubling of prices in a three-year period.
It is crazy. Are there any markets that are, have been more moderate all the way through?
Yeah. So markets that where we saw a lot of migration from, like Boston was one, Chicago was another market, even New York City, was pretty flat and declined during the pandemic. But also markets that are sort of along the Midwest markets, those affordable markets, that just don't usually hit the radar when you talk about big cities across the U.S. Those are the markets that didn't see, but are now actually seeing much stronger increase in home prices. Like Chicago, for example, Boston. Case shows it more clearly just because it's narrowed down to 20 markets. So you don't have like this whole 392 markets to look at, which can sometimes be confusing. But going back to the point that it's these markets that didn't see a lot of appreciation during the pandemic that are now seeing a lot of appreciation. And those are the Midwest and those are Northeast markets, and just markets that sort of were on the down low during the pandemic.
That's great in one way, but then you just think, where are the affordable markets? If, we know that the coast, even if they've declined a little bit, it's not like most people can afford, the median home in coastal markets. If then there's all this, in the Midwest or other places that weren't booming, where are the affordable markets now?
Yeah, I think, the theme here, what I'm gathering from just where people are, where mortgage applications are going, where we see more sales activity, it's this like secondary and tertiary markets in many of these more affordable states. So one thinks about, I'm trying to come up with a market here, the Carolinas, right? And the big cities in Carolinas are now very unaffordable because of the home price. But all the markets further out, suburban, exurban, or even like, just like I said, tertiary markets that are really small town kind of markets, that's where the affordability, really where you can now at the end find any affordability left. So, but I would, when one thinks about affordability, I would also say that, people wealth has grown, particularly during the pandemic too, but over these years of home price appreciation and wage growth and millennials starting to get paid for all the education that they had gone through over last decade. So people in general have more money. I mean, not to say, not to underestimate the hardship for those who cannot afford, but just to make a point that there are still a lot of people who can afford, and that's why we see that pressure on prices build up again. So
So one of the things that we see, a good thing about that, listen, if you're a homeowner, if you've been a homeowner during this period, you have made out, right? It's something that Logan Motoshami talks about, something because you have had this fixed debt cost, but meanwhile, your house is appreciated. So we do see that we have a lot of people who have home equity. So what are they doing with that home equity right now?
Yeah, so to give you some numbers on home equity, which every time I look at them surprise me because they're really high, right? On average, people have like some $274,000 in equity in their home. A mortgage borrower has, so that's quite a bit. Coming out of the Great Recession, we were at about $74,000. So that means a four-fold increase in that available equity. Now, we did see home equity authorization surge in 2022 before mortgage rates went up quite a bit. But even so, now, when we look at 23 authorizations in dollar volume, it still remains elevated compared to all the previous years coming out of the Great Recession, because people do have so much, and really, and that was a theme, I think, through many conversations at our event, is that mortgage originators are spending more time thinking about how to do these home equity loans. So people are tapping into them, and they are using them for maybe an extension of, maybe they give some down payment to their kids so they can buy their homes. Maybe they're buying a second home, because if you have a $300,000 in equity and you take out only like 150 out of that, which is 50%, you can still put a huge down payment on another home in a more affordable market, right? I mean, you can play with the money here in a number of ways, but just to have that wealth means that, people are employing it.
No, I think that's a great point. But we don't see people doing there aren't those kind of risky products where it's like, I'm going to take all, use it like an ATM machine, right. Especially now with, rates going up. Nobody's going to be doing that, right?
Yeah. No, that's definitely true. I mean, I think, lending standards, ever since they're tightened, we have yet to see any loosening, maybe on the margin, but not to any point where we would be concerned yet. We did see also increase in ARMs, or adjustable rate mortgages, which usually tends to worry people just because of what happened during the Great Recession. But even with those, because they're locked in such low rates, and even if they're not locked, even if they're not originated now to 6-7% mortgage rate, people are qualified at whatever max that rate could go at. So we're not seeing any funky products out there, which is really helping stabilize the situation, right? It just leads to less risk long-term, more sort of stability in the housing market. I feel that way. We'll see. Hopefully I'm not wrong.
You had a great panel. You had Sam Cater from Freddie Mac. You had Mike, Fred, and Tony from MBA. And the three of you guys, so you gave a presentation, which was super great. And then they kind of jumped in too. And one of the things that they talked about was the number of millennials, just that demographic push and how that's helping us right now.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we knew that coming into this period, and we talked about it well into 2020s, but then pandemic sort of threw everything out of perspective. And we thought, okay, now millennials won't be, but, there was a lot of like, what happens with millennials? Well, they're still there, and there's still a huge number of them that are about to turn that first-time home buying age, being whatever, 33 or, depending on the stat, but early 30s. There is like almost 15 million of them that are about to turn that age. And so they are wealthier than their previous generations because they have, done all the education. They make pretty great money, particularly if they is a double, income household. They don't have a lot of kids, and the other thing is, the student loans were on deferral for all this time, so they could have accumulated even more down payment, so we do worry about what happens with student debt going forward, and if some people fall off the edge because of it. But there is still huge chunk of people ready and able to buy a home, and they are actively looking right now.
So, what would you say to, our audience is full of, different kinds of professionals in housing, whether that's, mortgage loan officers, real estate agents, title, appraisal, across the spectrum. And one of the things when you see this kind of home price appreciation is like, when is that going to stop? can it just keep going higher, or do you guys see like, okay, here comes the correction somewhere?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I do worry about home prices increasing at the pace they are, but that monthly gain that I was talking about is plateauing at this point, and with mortgage rates again going up to 7%, I think we may see even more so of this plateauing. But what plateauing means, just returning back to the average rate of monthly gains. So we are seeing that. But what's interesting in our forecast, the CoreLogic our HPI forecast, is that we do see a more than average increase in HPI on a year over year basis through year end before it returns back to long run average. So it overshoots that 4.5%, that's the long run average, to about 6%. And then it goes back because, there is the affordability question here for sure. And so I think, there will be markets now that will correct a year down the road because of that. And I mentioned, we do worry at this point about some of the Florida markets that overshot in terms of overvaluation. So, it may be something that's going to take a couple of years to play out, right? But I don't think it's not sustainable. We can't see home prices just keep going like this. I mean, there's going to be corrections depending on, but I think the corrections will depend on migration patterns. If you continue to see inflow of people going to Florida, and those tend to be retirees. They have income, they have cash, they can bid home prices higher. That's at play as well. But in markets that mostly depend on their local residents for the housing activity or home buying activity, that's where incomes and prices have to align better.
I think that's a great point. Some of Sam's presentation that you guys did was his findings of like those out migration cities. Everyone thought, oh, everyone's going to Florida, everyone's going to Texas. He was like, people are going those places, but people are also just going within 1 to 2 hours of where they were. So his example was Riverside, California, is the number one city where you see inflow, migration into that, which, I mean, that's outside of Los Angeles, right? So they didn't go that far.
Yeah, so that's the interesting thing. Like, we tend to generalize a lot of trends, and we'll say, everybody is going.
Right.
Well, not everybody is going, but so people do tend to stay still historically close to where they were. It's now that we do see when a migration does happen outside the area, it tends to happen very far outside the area. So they sort of jump over a few states and land somewhere else. I think that the other point that was obvious in his presentation, because it also showed trends prior to the pandemic as well as now, is that we see continuation of trends that started before the pandemic. And even before the pandemic, we saw folks moving out of the very expensive areas and very urban environments to more affordable, to more less dense areas where they can in fact have like a single family home with a yard, and I think maybe demographics play a role here, because when you're a millennial in 20s, you have different wants and needs than when you're a millennial in 30s. And I mentioned, they do have fewer children, but they eventually do have children too. And then that's when this whole desire, and then also working from home, you do need that extra bedroom to do this kind of thing that we're doing right now, is talking on the Zoom, talking on the phone, talking on, if you're going to be working from home 3 days a week or however many days a week. And so I think maybe just the concept of what home means is changed, and that's driving some of these patterns as well.
I think that's an excellent point, that these things were in play before the pandemic, but obviously we saw his chart. It's definitely been going, and then it just took this big leap during the pandemic, but it keeps going back. Like we see that this is the trend going forward, just like the trend has been that people stay in their homes longer, right? That has been increasing for the last decade at least, and yet some of these things just feel like they got bigger all of a sudden, or we started paying attention to them maybe. And I think the migration story is one of those where it's like, where did people go? Where are they going to end up? And we have seen some people go and then come back, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that's why some of the markets that saw declines in home prices when mortgage rates spiked is a reflection of that sort of reversal, not necessarily reversal, but not as many people coming into the area. I'll say like Idaho, for example, Idaho is one area where we've seen some of the largest declines, and we continue to see monthly declines. And I think it's because the area benefited from people coming in with larger incomes, more spending power, pushed prices way over what local residents can afford. And now those prices are adjusting. So, to bring it back to migration, yes, some folks left temporarily. And we also, for example, we can see that in our single family rent index, because single family rent is one of those segments of the market that really benefited from pandemic, because people could move anywhere, and they moved, they in search of amenities, in search of being outside, and those that can move are usually higher income folks. And so we saw the highest rent tier grow more during the pandemic than lower tier, and now it's slowing faster than the lower tier. Same thing for prices. Higher tier price growth was higher during the pandemic than now. And it speaks to those who move out of necessity versus those who move out of convenience or desire to try out something new.
That is a great insight. I think that's really driving it. Well, when you guys look at like your forecast, you talked about looking out over the next year, but we know we're coming into not just from an inventory perspective, but from a pricing perspective. There's that seasonality you talked about. So, what does the fall look like? Like just not 2 years from now, but like what do we expect this fall?
Yeah, well, so we've had a couple abnormal years, but I would say in a normal year, we would see home sales activity slow in the fall. But really, the way it happens is it peaks in May, June, and then slows during the summer, July and August, because people tend to go on vacations. And historically, it picks back up in September and October, and then really falls off in the winter months. So if we do, in fact, are returning to those normal years or normal seasonality, that's what we would expect to see. Now, I will say that this year has been a little bit of we had a really disappointing spring, right? We had mortgage rates, particularly over the last month or so, go up as much as 7% again, and really slowed that home sales that seasonal peak that we would see during that time. So I think it's going to be a disappointing year. Now, say if mortgage rates come down faster, in fall, I think that could be really boom activity. But it's not guaranteed that's going to happen. If we get into the Fed conversation, that's a whole different, an hour conversation. But it is, we do all expect mortgage rates to remain elevated. So, it's unlikely scenario. But if they do come down, it's potentially possible to see home sales activity spike up again in the fall.
I think it's fascinating because, we're talking about, it's not like there's booming demand, but there's just so little inventory. It's all of those factors together. So there's not enough inventory. There's enough demand to just keep prices high, even though mortgage rates are high. It's an insane market. But Selma, thank you for being on and helping us understand it more. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me again, Sarah.